Hey, welcome back, faithful politics listeners and watchers. If you're watching our YouTube channel, I am your political host, Will Wright, and I'm joined by my friend and faithful host, Pastor Josh Burtram. How's it going, Josh?
Well, I'm honored that you would call me your friend once again. Well, thank you. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. And this week we have with us Dan Partland. He's a veteran documentary producer and director for film and television. His work includes several landmark nonfiction films and series of the past 2 decades. He has twice won the Emmy for Best Nonfiction Series and been twice nominated Nonfiction Producer of the Year by the Producers Guild of America. And he is now out with a new film called God and Country. So welcome to the show, Dan.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, so before we get started, obviously the majority of the time on this interview is going to be talking about God and Country. But before we kind of dig into that, tell us a little bit about your directing career and other films you've helped create.
Well, I think my work has really run the gamut. I think, I got into doing documentaries back, like straight out of college in the 90s and worked with legendary documentary filmmaker Albert Maysles when he had a company then. And that was really the cinema verite tradition of documentaries. So documentaries, what cinema verite is about, immersing the camera in real time unfolding events, following people around. And, I very much believed in that kind of filmmaking. I still do, an observational cinema that is very inherently humanizing. Go in with people and see what their real lives are like. And that's really what brought me into it. And I really thought that a film like this, like God and Country, was kind of the furthest thing from what I was interested in doing, because it seemed like it was, this is a archival documentary driven by clips and by interviews. But I did, in 2013, I was brought in to do a series for CNN called The 60s, which was a historical archival documentary series. And I discovered that I loved it. I'd spent my entire career sort of avoiding the form because I really wanted to show how documentaries could be, I think the feeling was when I was growing up, is that documentaries were a little like medicine. They were good for you, but they weren't that fun, it didn't taste good. And so I just really believed in it and wanted to make documentaries that people would actually go to and watch with their precious, spare time, entertainment. But over time, you also really you don't want to be making empty calories, right? You don't want to just be making tasty, fun stuff and okay, we ate some popcorn and we had a good time. You like them to, in some way, be enriching the audience. I mean, I think all filmmakers are doing that, in narrative storytelling. You want the audience to walk away with some new insights about people or situations that may be valuable to them, have a vicarious experience that applies to them. But anyway, so, God and Country is a good example because really I'm trying to bring these two different ideas together, give it a narrative shape and a narrative tone that draws people through the storytelling so that you feel the same way you would on a scripted narrative film, like you are on the edge of your seat. You're being told a story and you're being, sort of pulled through that story in an emotional way, even though the principal content is, coming from interviews, not an immersive camera like we were doing in the cinema verite days.
That's really awesome. But I guess why God and Country? Was there a specific event that, kind of sparked the idea for this documentary?
Well, I came to the content really because just looking at our political dysfunction right now, country has gotten terribly, terribly dysfunctional. Hyperpartisanship, polarization leading to extremism. And, so when I was approached about this project from, some other producers who had been trying to find a way to tackle this content as a film, I was very interested. And I think I had previously, just by being a politically engaged person, I had a familiarity with the sort of 80s era rise of the of the moral majority, of the Christian right as a political force. But the nature of our current media silos is that if you're not going out and seeking information about it, you might not know what's going on. And so I really was not current on the size and scale of this Christian nationalist kind of political movement, this fusing of Christian rhetoric, lacking in actual Christian faith, but a fusing of Christian rhetoric with a political agenda. I really hadn't kept up. And so it was really eye-opening for me to see how one after another of the major culture war friction points right now in our politics are in some way driven by this movement. So, once getting immersed in it, then I really started to feel like, it's important that we talk about it. And the thing that the most devout people who I was talking to about this were concerned about was not just the impact on American democracy, which is which was an alarming impact. But they were particularly focused on the damage that it's doing to their faith itself.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And I don't know if you've ever heard this, Dan, but one of my favorite things to do is to study the Gospels. I mean, I'm one of those theology nerds, and Bible, language nerds that's what Will was kind of referring to. But what's interesting about the Gospels is that, they are kind of in a category of ancient biography, but they're kind of different. Some people have even gone to say it's its own unique kind of Christo biography. There's Professor Craig Keener that we've had on the show before that talks about it in that way. And when I've thought about what kind of current media or medium of influence and creativity is most like the Gospels, I think a lot of times I think of documentaries, because you're taking a really important point. You're very selective about what you get in there, which doesn't mean dishonesty, right? Selectivity is not dishonesty. It's just filtering. It's trying to use the massive amounts of data available to make a point, and a compelling point. I thought you did that very well in this documentary. I was disturbed, which I'm sure was part of what you wanted to do. I was disturbed and a little bit ashamed, honestly, of my own tribe. I hail as a Pentecostal by birth, and so I see my own people, so to speak, up there prophesying all these things at the center of this controversy. And, I personally was very compelled, disturbed, and it really stirred me inside. So congratulations. It did exactly what it was supposed to do, I think, in my heart. So thanks for doing that. But my question is, what do you want people to take away from this documentary? Kind of give us a step back, give us an overview of what's the main thing you kind of want people to hear and be challenged by. You kind of are alluding to it, I think, in the last answer, but even going into more depth into that, and then kind of how is this relating to the current religious and political landscape that you have seen, experienced, and even more dug into, I'm sure, as you were preparing and creating this documentary?
Well, there's a great question that requires a kind of comprehensive answer. This is the hardest question of all to answer as a filmmaker, because people say, what do you want people to get from the film? And I'm like, everything that's in it. That's what
everything.
But the film gets into a lot of different stuff, and it's ambitious, I think, in its desire to really connect a lot of dots for things that people have been seeing in the culture, and to understand a little bit about how they're related and where they come from, the origins of Christian nationalism as a kind of political identity in America, the history, the modern history anyway, of how it got started, its overlap with issues of race, et cetera, and so forth. There's a lot there. But look, I think the better answer is that at minimum, I definitely want people to just understand what it is. And I actually think that's pretty hard. I think that's a pretty hard, I think that I think it's a pretty
I
hard
agree.
place to have your low bar, because it's a complicated thing to understand, and it took me a while. I think getting a passing familiarity with it is pretty easy, but really getting your head around it, about, where this line is and ought to be between um, someone's faith and the role that it would play in informing their ideas and their politics, and where there should be a line that allows other people, in a democracy, that allows other people to reach different conclusions. I think that is genuinely a complicated thing. First, I always say that, like, the term itself is terrible. It's so problematic. Like, Christian nationalism, it sounds like it's probably a good thing. It's probably a nice thing. It's like something that merges my love of country with my love of faith, and who wouldn't want that? Americans, I think, love both of those things: their nation and their Christian faith.
Absolutely.
So, you need to really understand that it isn't Christianity, that it isn't a faith itself, but that it's really political ideology masquerading as a faith. And so you kind of have to get to there before you can understand the ways that it's corrosive, both to American democracy and then also to Christian teaching. But, I don't know, in the more in the broader sense of what I hope audiences would get. Look, I very much like talking about it, because I think it's something that we all have to be talking about, and would like to raise awareness about it in general. But more than anything, I want people to go and not listen to me, listen to people in the film. Those are the great voices. I learned so much from them. Basically, what you're doing as a documentary filmmaker is you're doing a deep dive, and you're figuring out how, becoming fully immersed in a topic, and then figuring out how to kind of cull it down and reduce it to something really potent that can be shared. Because other people are not, like, there's 18 voices in the film. They've all written books. I've read all of those books. Nobody's going to sit down and read 18 or 20 books when they just want to understand what the heck Christian nationalism is. So we've done the work to try to, like, boil it down to in essence, and to tell a dramatic story that lets you understand not just like the stats, not just the facts, but also the important emotional points of it. So that's what I want to do. I really want people to go and hear from the great voices in the film. The whole idea was to amplify them.
One of the things I think I love the most about your documentary, and this may sound somewhat selfish, but watching your documentary was a bit of a confirmation for me, because we've been working on our own sort of audio documentary about Christian nationalism for the past year. There's a lot of voices that are in your documentary who have been guests on our show. So, Anthea Butler, Kristen Dumais, Andrew Seidel, Andrew Whitehead, Shane Claiborne, and Russell Moore. I think that's all of them. I think I got them all. There's a few others that we love to have on our show. Looking at you, David French, but watching your documentary and the way you're kind of weaving and kind of telling the story and using the expertise of the guests, I couldn't help but wonder, like why did these guests, why were these guests sort of the best at explaining the story that you're trying to tell? Because there's and I'm not asking that because I'm questioning like the guests. I think they're all great, but like, what about their storytelling? What about their book writing? That sort of inspired you to have them on.
Well, you're always just looking for the best voices, but you're also looking for, or I'm also always looking for, inside perspectives, So, there's a mix in the film. They're all insiders, and experts, one way or another, but there's a mix of different perspectives that they're coming at this content from, right? There's faith leaders, there's scholars, there's secular scholars, and there's religious scholars. There's people that, even among the scholars, a lot of them themselves are, deeply devout, where their faith is very forward in their identity, and some of them are, have a faith tradition that's, not as prominent. So, and they're across the political spectrum. There's people who lean to the left, who lean to the right. There's people who are deeply conservative. In general on that stuff, like the scholars, I generally don't, those are not partisan players, I mean, whatever their politics may be, that's their business. But if you're interviewing a scholar, I mean, I take it the premise is that you're there to hear their expertise. And if they're a scholar of any quality, which all of these are, their own personal, story is not really pertinent to their scholarship. But it's also important in a film like this to have people who are unapologetic about the influence of their personal story on their point of view. So, yeah David French is unapologetically a political conservative and himself an evangelical. So, yes, we didn't just want people who were gonna tell the story from an academic remove. We wanted people who had real life experience with it. And we also, in this film, we really tried to tried to find the best voices, but I did definitely feel like almost everybody in the film has some level of really important connection, personal connection, to the content. And in another version of the film, we might have made more of that. But in the end, I think we had glimpses of the way their personal story maybe overlaps with this, but it stayed in a more of a more of a straight reporting lane.
Yeah, and just kind of from a I don't know, logistics or artistic sort of point of view, I noticed that when you were showing certain Christian nationalist adherents, you'd have sort of their title, and then you'd have like their reach. And I thought that was a very interesting sort of like aspect. And I'd love for you just to kind of maybe talk us through like what was sort of the thought process to kind of, list, okay, Alex Jones, whatever, 8 million people or something like that.
Yeah. Well, thank you for pointing that out. It's been a long time since I thought about, how that ended up in the film. But I do think it's really important. I think that everybody has to make their, okay, so we live in this polarized time where it feels like, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, everybody is saying some apoplectic things about the end of the country and the end of, and it all just sounds like very dramatic. And the question is always like, are we all just whipping each other up, fear-mongering, because that's good storytelling, right? That's the question, is like, the breathless coverage on cable news is always turned to 11. Now, I have no doubt that the people who are turning it to 11 are sincere in their belief that things are to 11. But you do have to ask yourself if, how do we make sure that we're not all playing into this problem of over dramatizing and fear mongering, because that really commands a lot more attention. And so the question of all of the Christian nationalist leaders, pastors, and all that are people who we're showing how the ways in which they manifest Christian nationalism. The question is, are they just a sideshow? Are we just cherry picking stuff that isn't really that pertinent? I mean, anyone can find somebody out there who's saying something outrageous and show the clip and all that. So we wanted, we were doing our own check on that. Are we just being drawn to outrageousness to dramatize this issue, or are we talking about something real? And the way we checked to see, like, what is the actual reach of these clips? So yeah, when, a lot of people will look at some of the pastors in the movie and say, like, well, that doesn't really represent what's going on. But I don't know. Does he's got 2.3 million followers. I don't know. I don't. I think that really is the challenge. Our determination is that the people who we're showing really are pertinent. That altogether, this reach that you're talking about is massive and undeniable. But you're welcome to go and look, and say, like, well, that guy just has 2 million followers, and maybe that's not that significant compared to how many good and decent pastors are at every local church in the country. That's a complicated analysis, and I think we should ask ourselves that. But the thing that I think is undeniable is even, there's a lot of this out there, and it has real reach.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. When I grew up, I basically thought in order to be a good Christian, you needed to be a good American. And in order to be a good American, you needed to be a good Christian. I mean, I don't know, like, I don't necessarily think anyone said that explicitly to me. I mean, I grew up in Northern Virginia, so it wasn't like this ultra conservative place. It was always kind of purple, always going back and forth. Will and I were actually kind of joking about it because the school system I grew up in, Fairfax County public school system, that's where I had all my education, was probably, one of the more liberal, at least now, school systems in the entire country, and probably was at that point when I graduated. And I won't say that year just for the sake of my own feelings of, being young and keeping my youngness and youth here. But, the first time, honestly, I really felt this so deeply as I moved out to Ohio, and I started getting around a lot of friends, and Obama got reelected, and some of my closest friends wept. They had to stay in the house all day, or they couldn't talk because they were so afraid of what was happening. And I just was like, guys, I mean, I'm not a huge fan of Obama's policies, whatever, but come on, like, what do you mean? Like, America is like, just calm down, guys. It's all right. It's going to be okay. But I know how that fear can get stoked in the person and in the heart. And we've talked about it before. You control someone's fears, then you can control their life. If you can get them angry and fearful, which is one of the guests said on your podcast. I mean on the documentary. I do podcasts all the time, sorry. Yeah. But on your documentary, and it's true. You get people angry and afraid, and those two things are kind of two sides of the same coin. You can get them activated. And watching this documentary felt like it brought this story together for me. And I think what disturbed me so much about it is like, wow, this makes sense. I mean, I lived through this. I've seen people do this. I've had friends that have stopped supporting me, that have stopped being there. Even some of them maybe even stopped talking to me because I'm too liberal now, even though I consider myself extremely conservative, but not the kind of conservative that's out there. One of the most disturbing pictures I think I've ever seen, is that picture of this white, pretty Jesus with a MAGA hat on. And it honestly makes me sick to my stomach. And I'm not talking about policies. I voted for Trump in 2016, and I get policies. I'm not here to debate that stuff. And I've read the Democratic National Committee and their agenda, and so much of it, I was like, oh, that's not for me. That's not for my faith. And yet at the same time, I look at this other RNC, and it just fits so perfectly, and it fits too perfectly. And it's like it feels like we're being used. Eesh. And I think one of the things that you brought out was that idea, and got some of these people from the inside, from people who have been there. My dad knew personally knew as friends, some of the people you had on the documentary. And so it's really compelling. And I just got to ask, as you're piecing this story together, how did you kind of go through and sift through the massive amounts of data in order to not cherry pick, like you kind of talked about before? It's how did you put this story together? I I'm just curious as to how that happened and you decided which threads to pull on, like going to Jerry Falwell or Paul Weyrich or Bob Jones University. How did you kind of decide which ones to go on and move through that process as you put this narrative together?
Well, I mean, that's the $64,000 question. I mean, you don't. I think
I love asking you easy questions, Dan. I just
we had
love
we
making it
had
easy for you.
we had a very so the the show the movie, the original conception of it was that it would be a multi-part series. And it's because the topic is so vast. There was like a whole episode on education. There was a whole episode on the courts, and kind of looked at it, and I just felt like, you know what? There's tons of material. There's no question. There's fascinating and important stuff to say about all of that. But the more important thing is the whole picture. Like I don't really, I'd love people to understand the intricacies of how this overlays with the courts and with policy. But I feel like it's such difficult material for all the reasons that you said, that it's like, it's dramatic. I mean, the movie is dramatic, but it's also challenging. And I feel like, yeah, I didn't want to have, like, no matter how good episode one is, people want to come back and watch episode two? Like, that's just like, it's just, there's an ickiness about it. And you feel like, I mean, I think that the movie is compelling and you can't put it down, and it has to be. But yeah, but when you get to the end, I think people want to feel like, okay, I got the overview. I get this space. That was the goal. So, but we had this very ambitious outline, and it's like, well, how many of these ideas can we do? Can we service in the amount of time so that they're done justice? That they're not just whizzing past in too much of a cursory fashion. So the truth is, I think about how you approach any of these projects is you go after way more ideas than you have room for. And you tend to lean into the ones that turn out the best, for lack of a better way of putting it. And so sometimes I think, that's what's tricky about the form, is you can't necessarily make the film about anything. Like, you need to have speakers with great insights. You need to have, clips or visual content that help, that works with that to like make it all come together. But then, of course, there are certain ideas that you just know, like, one way or another, this has got to make the film. People will not understand the story without it. So there's a mix of different things. There was a very ambitious outline, a lot of things that I thought were great and amazing that didn't make it. That's, for storytelling, that's a good problem to have. But you also want the film to move along at a clip enough that keeps people entertained, that back to where we started, that it doesn't start to feel like medicine, that it feels like, they're watching because they want to watch. They're being gratified by the storytelling and by what they're, putting together, what they're experiencing and what's clicking for them. So, that's that audience is ultimately the master that you're serving.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I was wondering, like, what material didn't make it, that if you were to come out with a part two, or something, like, what elements would you want to include? Because it was, I was watching it and I'm thinking, oh, I wonder if he's going to go into the Seven Mountain Mandate here. Or if he's going to do a deep dive into polygenesis, or just some of that stuff. I mean, I just feel like you sort of open those doors, and I'd imagine that you probably have a lot of content material. So what would we have expected in the B-roll? The extra material.
Well, on the cutting room floor, yeah. I mean, of course, I think there is stuff about Seven Mountain Dominionism. I think. There's a lot of stuff about the courts. There's a lot of stuff about big court cases and how those were shaped and formed, and the efforts to influence the courts. I think we actually have really explosive stuff on that about the literal whining and dining of justices and, kind of horse trading to try to, to get influence Supreme Court justices. I think education is a whole huge story, an important story right now. We have a lot of great material on education and the ways in which, the ways in which, what do we call them, the voucher system,
Yeah.
and, being kind of needing to demonize public education has kind of been a goal of this movement for a really long time. Yeah, and I think there's also stuff, honestly, I think some of the early roots I think are really fascinating that, if we kind of picked up this story of where the modern Christian nationalist movement comes from, really starting in the 70s, as a, 60s and 70s roots and really growing in the 80s. But, there's almost there's another telling of it that goes back to maybe the 20s, it goes back to the Scopes monkey trial. That was a whole big interesting chapter that sort of formed a piece of the identity here of how the battle lines would be drawn against, a reaction to secular society that was, I think the Scopes monkey trial, that was ultimately, people forget in that case that, the sort of religious point of view actually won in court, but it ended up being kind of sort of embarrassing, right? Because the way the debate unfolded, it was just like, wait a minute, modernity is here. We can't just put our heads in the sand. We have to. So I think that did a lot to shaping this point of view that exists today about a lot of people of faith feeling that their beliefs are under attack from secular society. Anyway, just as a digression, I thought that was really interesting in education, and the ways what was going to be taught in schools and how we decide that was all baked together in that at that moment, and then really comes to full fruition in the Trump administration when Betsy DeVos says, and we clipped it on screen. She's the Secretary of Education, and she says, "I don't think public education should really exist."
Yeah.
Okay, that's an interesting choice for Secretary of Education.
Yeah, and just an FYI, like the drunk history version of the Scopes monkey trial is pretty hilarious for those that haven't seen it.
We'll check it out.
But
I've not seen that one.
It's pretty funny. But so I want to ask you just about your own personal faith, and one, if you have a faith, and then two, how did that faith or lack of faith sort of inform how you directed the film?
Well, yeah, I'm mostly a secular person, and the reason for that really is very related to this film, which is that I'm a product of an interfaith marriage, and so my parents, they kind of experienced faith as a way of putting barriers between people. They felt like, wait, they were in love. They were high school sweethearts. They'd been together for a really long time. Their families all knew each other. But when they decided to get married, there was some tension around that because they weren't of the same faith. And they felt like, okay, that's too divisive. There's no reason for that. And so they definitely raised us with, this is a choice everyone makes, and you should become informed on all kinds of different world faiths and make your own choice. But we didn't have our family didn't have a religious practice growing up, and so the result is, not surprisingly, I felt very left out. America is a very religious place, and I remember when we moved to a new town, we moved to a very conservative Christian, probably equal parts Catholic and mainline Protestant traditions. We moved to the suburbs. I was like 6 years old, 7 years old, maybe, I don't know. And it was the first question everybody asked me is what are you? I'd never been asked that. I
A
didn't know. I
human?
went back to
I
my
don't
parents. What
know.
am I? What am I? I don't understand the question. And they said, well, I think they're asking what religion are you? And I said, okay, what are we? What should I say? And I think they said something like, why don't you just say you're American? You're an American. So, of course, because of this, like now my family though, my cousins, there's interfaith marriage all over. So among the five families that comprise my first cousins, we have, Catholics, Presbyterians, atheists, uh, Jews, and Greek Orthodox. Not a single family has the same religion of another one of the cousins. Okay. So this is a very American story. And so different religious traditions, they didn't seem, they all seemed fine to me. They all seemed like just different religious traditions, and everybody went to each other's services and respected the way each other um, worshiped, prayed, and what they believed. And it just honestly, in my lifetime, different from I think when my parents got married, but by the time of my lifetime, I never, there was not a moment of tension surrounding that. Now, in recent years, and I'm talking just the past, since 2015, 16, there's a little bit of tension along these lines. But mostly, everyone in my family was always very comfortable to go to each other's services and worship in whatever way that family worshiped. And, I will say also, because of the deficiency in that I felt by not having been raised in a religious tradition, and my brother also, like we both, when I got to college, I took tons of religion courses. My brother majored in religion. He became,
Wow.
quite deep on it. And it's because, yeah, I think we were fascinated by it because we didn't have a lot of depth of knowledge there, and it was so prominent in American life.
Yeah, I mean, this idea of religious freedom and the diversity of people that are what America is supposed to be, this diverse place of openness to whatever you believe. One of my one of my favorite lines is in Arrested Development, which is one of my favorite shows. I think it was one of the most underrated shows in history. It's an amazing show. Anyway, I'm a preacher of the gospel of Jesus Christ, not of Arrested Development, but it is a good show, and I think people would think it was funny. But in this, one of the main characters, she goes, they've adopted, a kid from another country that has come, an immigrant, and she goes, you can pray to whoever you want. This is America, baby. You can worship whatever God you want. And I just thought, yeah, man, that's funny, but in this, like, in this tension that we're facing as a country, right? I feel like I've been on both sides of this, in the
It's like,
sense that, again, I've had very, very close friends that cried when Obama was elected, and I had very close people in my life that cried when Trump was elected, and were very
yeah.
fearful. And I'm certainly not unique in that,
Mhm.
but I'm looking at this whole picture, and I'm thinking, okay, so if I'm someone coming to this audience, right, I'm supposed to watch the documentary, and and the idea is that I need to be, or the purpose is for me to be compelled. The purpose is for me to be like, yeah, I need to look into this. I need to understand this Christian nationalism. There's a lot of people that I know that would just be like, well, Christian nationalism, it doesn't sound all that bad. I'm a Christian and I love my country, kind of like what you alluded to at the beginning of our conversation. So what's really so bad about that? And I'm just kind of anticipating questions, actually, that I would love for you to kind of address in your own way. Like maybe something like, well, what is the kind of difference between what the far right, or however this like contingency of Christian nationalism, what's the difference between what they have done during the Trump administration and what many people, again, I'm flattening nuance right now for the sake of time, But what many, many people that I knew and that the conversations I would have, especially in flyover country, right, the place in the middle where, which essentially elected Trump in so many ways. What is the what is they would wonder what's the difference? Didn't Obama do the same thing? If Obama had had a chance to get that many Supreme Court justices on there, wouldn't he have done the exact same thing, just in the opposite direction? And what's the difference? I'd love for you to kind of bring that out. Why? Of course, I sense the importance of it. I believe in the importance of it. I think this is a film that every Christian that I know should watch. My question is what's going to be on that? I don't know if I'm articulating this well, but what is the other side of this? Is there should another documentary come out about the left's agenda or whatever it may be? I guess I'm trying to wrestle in the tension, because many, many people will just cut it off right from the beginning. Oh, it's too biased, blah, 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 blah. And I don't think they should do that. I think
Yeah.
it's very important. Does the question make sense? I hope
Well, it does. I mean, listen, I think one of the reasons you're having a hard time articulating it is because we do tend to approach our politics in this equivalency model.
Yes, no doubt.
But they aren't equivalent, and that's the problem. So that when you're looking for an analogous other side, in some cases there just isn't an other side, or just it's not a credible other side. So now nobody wants to hear that. I mean, I think let's just take the example of one of the things that I think this Christian nationalist sentiment is doing is it's justifying bending all the rules of democracy in order to make sure it enacts its agenda. So, yeah, I think now if you believe that you're doing God's will, then that doesn't seem like a bad thing. I mean, okay, we're fudging a little bit on the margins, but I'm confident
Ends
that
justify the means.
It's justified, right? So when you look at, of course, both parties tend to gerrymander districts, right, to try to keep safe seats. So you'd say, okay, both sides are doing that. I think that the Christian nationalist movement has made serious and unmistakable efforts at voter suppression. Okay, so people, I think it's a false equivalency. You'd say, well, both sides are monkeying up the system, right? Are playing with the system. I think that, when you're overtly making efforts to suppress vote in certain places because you know that vote isn't going to go your way, I think that's gone too far. That is not the same, So I don't know, but I don't, mostly when I was hearing you ask the question, I think one of the challenges is to not get caught up in both sidesism, false equivalency kinds of debates. I mean, the film does not press any partisan agenda. It pushes an anti-Christian nationalist story because I think Christian nationalism is very dangerous, and I don't think it's faithful to conservatism. I don't think it's faithful to Christianity. I don't think it's faithful to the precepts of American democracy. So it's very hard for me to posit what the pro-Christian nationalist agenda is, because I think that it's not really defensible. So there isn't a false equivalent. There isn't an equivalency there that we should engage in. I think we should talk about what Christian nationalism is, and if people want to make the case that they think the United States ought to be less democratic to be effective at governance, people can make that case. But generally people don't make that case. They try to obscure that that's actually the goal, is to not have everybody be equally represented, but to have a privileged class of people one way or another because they have more influence on the Supreme Court, because they're able to suppress vote in one or another place, because et cetera and so forth, right? So I think I think if people were debating the issues honestly and fairly, we would have to talk about whether there really is a genuine belief in American democracy, and that means empowering all people and as many people as possible to make the critical choices about our representation, our leadership, our policies.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So I'm curious on what's Rob Reiner's connection to the film, because when it was first announced on social media, it seems like there's a lot of debates about, oh, what's he doing, as a part of this, and even some commentary from some folks from the Federalist Society had some pretty harsh words. So what's his role kind of in this whole thing?
Well, Rob is a producer on the film. He the project, which started with producer Steve Oken, and he was shopping it around to looking for producing partners, basically looking for somebody who might be able to help him get the film set up and financed and connect him with, resources, whatever. And, he met with all kinds of people, and he connected with Rob at one point, who read this book, a book by Catherine Stewart called The Power Worshippers. It's quite a good scholarly work on the topic. And he thought this was critically important. And he said, look, this is really important. I'd love to help make this happen. But I don't want to be a part of it because my presence will be too distracting. But he connected them with me. And then little by little, there was little bits of stewardship, and then we hit a certain point in the process, and he was like, I guess I'm just all in. There's no point in me, I would like to officially do this. And so it's interesting because, I know there was some scuttlebutt online. It was like the participants, most of the interviews were done at the point that Rob decided to actually sign on and officially be, join the team. I don't think, and I told everybody the moment that happened, I said, guess what? Rob Reiner's decided he's going to be part of it, and that's going to really help us in terms of publicity. It's going to help us in terms of, finance and all this other kind of stuff, connections to distribution. So, but yeah, I think there was, that's another example of a sort of controversy that I really don't think is important to weigh into. Of course, people would prefer that we were talking about some imagined behind the scenes controversy instead of something as boring as, what month and whether financing was in place and how he could be helpful to a project. And then we're not talking about Christian nationalism. And that was why he didn't want to be, that's why he didn't want to officially do the project. He wanted to kind of help it get started and step aside. But I think Rob's, to me, I think he's been an amazing partner because, first of all, he's fearless. And that's really important because it's dangerous. It's sketchy content to, you can get wigged out. But he's very courageous and he's very clear about his mission. And his mission is really, I'm completely in sync with it. He's all about religious liberty. He's not anti-Christian in any way whatsoever. And I think that his clarity and focus has been really helpful. In terms of the filmmaking side, I think he was a real help to me in sort of on the craft level. It wasn't like he had an agenda that he was forcing, he was empowering me to make the film I wanted to make. And, I'd showed him cuts, not even early cuts. I showed him cuts once they were already in the shape of a film, and just great insights about, this feels late. This is draggy here. I think we could do better with this. Is that the best clip for, craft notes? And we were just, speaking the same language. That's just a filmmaker language. It wasn't really, there was never a debate about I'd prefer if we talked more about, like, and because he agreed that the goal of the film was that we were not going to push any political agenda other than to just try to be really clear about what Christian nationalism is and the way it's affecting our democracy.
Yeah, if it's the same Rob Reiner, which I think it is, I'll always remember him as Jessica Day's dad on New Girl, and will never forget his role there. It forever touched my heart. So just wanted to add that in there.
It's so funny because that's it. You're revealing yourself. You really are young, Josh. You really are young. That's a generational divide.
Yes.
If people at a certain age, their favorite Rob Reiner appearances in The New Girl, and people of a different age, that maybe they'll Meathead is the important point of contact. But look, quite aside from his his on-camera performance, he's just one of the most successful film directors in American history. And those films tend to be about great American politics sometimes, but great American virtues, and they don't appeal to just one side of the political spectrum. They have a universal appeal. But before we run out of time, Josh, I wanna, if I'm allowed, I'm a documentary filmmaker, I'm used to asking questions.
Sure.
Please.
So I wanted to ask you, because actually your response, that is so interesting to me and heartening to me, of how you described your response to the film, of feeling, compelled, scared, worried, also challenged. And because I think that is the hardest part, is like, when they brought me into the film, I said, I was interviewing for it. I said, I want you to know that if I were to take this on, it would be really important to me that this be a pro-Christian film. I think Christianity, has done, just immeasurable good on the planet, kind of by every metric, in terms of its personal, just personal impact on individuals, in terms of its movement in the culture, impact on governments, on policies. Now, a lot of the great Christian virtues are not unique to Christianity. Other faiths share a lot of these same principles.
Sure,
but there's
absolutely.
no question that, as the joke goes, you want to know, like, how big is Christian influence? What year is it? So
Right.
yes, and I think it was terrible. We learned the lesson post 9/11, that because there's like extremists doing bad stuff in the name of a faith, in that case Islam, you can't throw out the baby with the bathwater. You can't just demonize everybody because of an extremist faction. And that's really how I view the Christian nationalist movement in America, is that it's kind of, it's an extremist version. I don't know that it's actually Christian at all. I don't even know what the argument would be. And so it sucks, like I said, that Christian is in the title of it, because I think it will put people of faith on their heels, because everyone is on a team and they feel a lot protective, rightly protective of that team. But anyway, so my question to you is just like, well, how do you process that? What does that feel like as you're watching the film, and how do you sort of reconcile those different emotions? Because, as a filmmaker, I'm really trying to manage that and make sure that people who are good, decent, well-meaning Christians who are not caught up in this are not feeling tarred with the same brush.
Well, one thing for me, honestly, and it was scary. Yeah, it was shaking, but I wasn't feeling like that because I felt like I was getting the wool pulled over my eyes or something. Mm-hmm. I was being led somewhere where I didn't want to go. I think that for me, I was looking at this, and I've been that. I am evangelical. I'm like Paul before Festus. Man, if only all of you would be like I am, except for these chains. Like, I'm not in chains, but like I want that idea. Like, I want everyone to be a Christian because they know Jesus and have experienced the love of Jesus, not because it's a political thing and it's something forced on them. And I honestly think this is so good and it's necessary for evangelical Christians to watch this film because judgment begins in the house of God. That's what the Apostle Paul said. People need to read their Bibles, understand judgment begins in the house of God. And the Christian church in America has a lot of splaining to do about how we have partnered, and basically we're obsessed with power, and we're obsessed with keeping our power and our status, which is the exact opposite of what Jesus came to show and do. And I think you did a great job of bringing in names that people would recognize, like Russell Moore. Great, because that guy is as conservative as you can get, and his words are so good. And I just think it hit the right mix. So I'm going to encourage, I've already talked to my dad about it and different people, and I'm going to encourage people to do that. And it's just processing through like, hey, let's just look at reality right now and the idolatry of God's people in America right now. And so that was good. And sometimes you need an outside voice to do that, to speak truth, and it was good.
Thank you.
So
Thank you for saying
doing
that.
it.
That's so important to me. And it brings up the other thing, which I think is, when you said, what's the takeaway? What do you want people to have? Is that this stuff is so hard to talk about. Like, I've just spent kind of 2 years immersing myself in it. I know, all kinds of arcanery. I know there, and I can't, if I'm at a dinner, with a friend or a relative who's maybe slipped off that side of things, I don't think I could navigate it. I mean, it's so sensitive and it's so hard. So one of the things we really thought of the film as a tool is just to say, hey, will you watch this for me? I just want, I want to get your take on this. I watched it and it was meaningful to me. Dad, cousin, whatever, would you take a look at it? And then I'd love to talk to you afterwards.
That's
because
good.
I think, listening to me on a podcast, I don't know anything. The whole idea of a documentary is that, I brought those people together and made this consolidated thing, so that you could have a bit of the experience that I was lucky enough to have of learning from the people who were kind of most thoughtful on the topic, and put it all together in one place. So you can have a version of that experience that hopefully, moves you and informs you in your own thinking.
That's really awesome. I was thinking as you were saying that,
so good.
Maybe part of your advertising strategy is to put it on tracks and then go go and hand them out, just that's a freebie. That's a freebie.
Yeah. Thank you. No consultancy. Yeah.
But my last question to you is, how can people actually see the film?
Yeah. Well, the film opens February 16th, theaters nationally. To find out the theater nearest you, I mean, they're still being booked. Theaters kind of schedule kind of closer to the release date, but there's probably 20 or so theaters up there right now. You have to go to our website. It's called godandcountrythemovie.com, all spelled out. godandcountrythemovie.com, and click on the theaters tab, and it'll show you where it's playing. It's exclusively in theaters. We want it to be in theaters. We want people to go and have that experience of seeing it in the movie, because I think that experience is super powerful. Down the road, if you missed it there, sure, eventually it'll end up on streaming platforms and things like that. But go see it. Go see it in the theaters. Bring a friend, and start the conversation. That's the whole idea.
Yeah. Have you thought about doing any screenings with Congress members or anything like that?
Funny you should ask. We screened it at the United States Capitol just a few days ago, for a lot of policy people. Yes, of course, lawmakers need to see it. Pastors need to see it. We've also looked at, and there's also resources on the website if congregations want to do special screenings. I think that would be really important for church groups to come and show it in their church, or schedule a place. We can set up a screening specifically for them, because I think it is You know, social pressure, one of the things the film doesn't talk about, but is social pressure. You know, we're all in these different bubbles. And I think some of this stuff has become such a norm that I mean, what I found from talking to Christians around the country is like there is at this point a huge pent up demand for this conversation. There's so many Christians who are kind of been going along with it, a little bit swept up in it, maybe reluctantly, or maybe they're just not making waves, but they don't like it. It's time for those people to step forward and to say, yeah, this is an important thing and we got to talk about it.
Absolutely. Well, Dan, thank you so much for stopping by. We just had a wonderful time talking with you. Good luck on this film, God and Country. Go see it. What's the website one more time? godandcountry.com?
godandcountrythemovie.com opens in theaters February 16th. Check out on the website for the latest theaters near you. There's a good tool in there for finding theaters. Tell a friend, and use it as a tool. If you're partial to this idea and you understand where we're coming from, will you watch this for me? It's an important conversation starter.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again for being on our show, and to our audience. Make sure you keep your conversations not right, not left, but up, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thank you.